We step away from the book of Acts this Sunday and we are going to look at a psalm. This psalm makes a prayer to God, and it's a prayer, believe it or not, for God's wrath. And I thought we would take a look at this psalm this morning because it's beautiful, but also because I think it has something to teach us about God's wrath, what it is, and what it might mean in our own lives. Listen for the word of the Lord. Let God rise up. Let his enemies be scattered. Let those who hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melts before the fire, let the wicked perish before God. But let the righteous be joyful. Let them exult before God. Let them be jubilant with joy. Sing to God. Sing praises to his name. Lift up a song to him who rides upon the clouds. His name is the Lord. Be exultant before him. Father of orphans, protector of widows, is God in his holy habitation. God gives the desolate a home to live in. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious live in a parched land. O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth quaked, the heavens poured down rain at the presence of God, the God of Sinai, at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Rain in abundance, O God, you showered abroad. You restored your heritage when it languished. Your flock found a dwelling in it. In your goodness, O God, you provided for the needy. Sing to God, O kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises to the Lord. O rider in the heavens, the ancient heavens, listen. He sends out his voice, his mighty voice. Ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel, and whose power is in the skies. Awesome is God in his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He gives power and strength to his people. Blessed be God. This is the word of the Lord. Now, when people say that God shows no partiality, they could be right, they could be wrong, depending what they mean. If they mean that God cannot be bribed, that his justice isn't corrupt, that God won't spare his favorites from following the rules, then they are right. When Paul says this in Romans chapter 2, God shows no partiality, he is making an argument that God's own people are not exempt from judgment just because they follow the true religion. So if that's what you mean by God shows no partiality, then it's true. But if you mean that God does not take sides, then it's not true. This psalm shows us a God who does take sides. The widows, the orphans, the poor, the desolate, the prisoners, God does have a special relationship with them. And this psalm reminds us about it. God does favor the vulnerable in society. Now, do you know who the greatest critic of Christianity in history was? He was a German philosopher named Nietzsche, sometimes pronounced Nietzsche. He was the greatest critic of Christianity of all time, and I will tell you why. It's because he knew Christianity much better than the other critics. He really understood what he was rejecting when he rejected Jesus, and not everyone does. He knew that God favored the vulnerable and the poor and the widow and the orphan and the weak and the needy. And he despised this about it. When Paul, for instance, said that God's strength is made perfect in weakness, or when Jesus said, "What you have done to the least of these, you've done to me," this turned Nietzsche's stomach. But that is what Christianity is. That is who our God is. the psalm reminds us that God takes the side of the weak and the vulnerable, and he fights for them. He fights for the people who can't fight for themselves. This was very important to Israel, because Israel was not like us. Israel was not like the United States. If you wanted to make analogies, we have much more in common with biblical nations like Egypt or Babylon or Assyria or Rome, for that matter. They were the superpowers of the Bible. But Israel wasn't. Israel was a group of, first of all, rescued slaves. A bunch of slaves that were led out into the desert to start a small nation in the middle, caught in between. And if you look at where it is geographically, it is surrounded by other superpowers. Israel was like that 90-pound weakling on a playground full of bullies. So it makes sense that Israel would worship a God who defended the bullied and who judged the bullies. And this character of God, it stays consistent throughout the Bible. Jesus said the same thing about God, that God's kingdom would cut down the proud and lift up the lowly. And Nietzsche hated this about Christianity too. Here's what he wrote. What is good, Nietzsche said, all that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. We can learn about a thing by seeing its opposite. Christians could learn a lot about Christianity by reading Nietzsche, because in his philosophy, we truly see the opposite of our faith. We see the opposite of our Savior. We see the opposite of our values. And so this psalm speaks of a God whose wrath burns against the mighty in defense of the vulnerable. So then let's ask the question, how did the wrath of God fall into some disrepute among us? It's not a very popular topic. And why not? I think it's because the church used wrath as a hammer, as a tool, as a way to control or to manipulate, and I can even understand why. But think about it. Imagine that you're a youth pastor and you have 50 teenagers in front of you. How are you going to get them to pay attention to the Bible when they only left their video games at home probably for the prospects of finding a date? That's half the reason why I went to youth group, I'll admit it. No, but how are you going to do that? How are you going to get people to listen or pay? You can't even get adults to pay attention or listen. How are you going to do it? Well, an easy and an tempting way is to scare them. And when I was in youth group, I can remember my youth pastor reminding us somewhat ominously that we could die on our way home from youth group that night. And if we did, where would we go? I remember one night he even showed us pictures of auto accidents where teenagers had been killed to scare us. And you know what? It worked. I listened to him that night a little bit more closely. I can understand it. I don't think it's right, and I don't do it. But I can understand it. So that's how it happened. The church used wrath to scare people, to manipulate them, to get them to pay attention, to get them to take things seriously. And a lot of Christians, I think, would prefer not to talk about wrath at all, to sort of ignore it, even though it's a part of a lot of these psalms, a part of these biblical passages. It's a part of who God is. We ignore it. And there was a Christian theologian, H. Richard Niebuhr, who wrote a famous line that satirized this type of wrathless Christianity. He said, "A God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment." So the anti-wrath sentiment maybe has gone too far, and we've left a lot of important things out of Christianity by ignoring it. And there are still others who are happy to think about God's wrath on other people, usually on people who aren't like them. But they like to imagine, on the other hand, that God is very merciful and kind to them. So it's God's wrath for you and God's gentleness for me. The church father Gregory of Nyssa wrote about this kind of hypocrisy. He described these hypocrites by saying this: worst of all, they want to move the divine towards contrary desires. They would divide the power of God into two, namely into savagery and loving kindness. On the one hand, they want him to be gracious and gentle to themselves. On the other, they ask him to show himself hard and bitter to their enemies. Oh, the folly of the babblers. They're still around. That was in the 4th century. We still have babblers. For if God, he says, is harsh to them, he will not be mild to you. If you hope that he will be inclined to show mercy to you, how can he change to the opposite, from mercy to bitterness? There's a way to think and speak about God's wrath that is not a manipulation. And many of the church fathers stress that when the scriptures speak of God's wrath, what they are describing is not a literal change in God's feelings or mood, but it is the way we experience God from a human point of view. God doesn't change from love to anger the way a fallen human being does. The analogy or the metaphor that they used was to say that God is like the sun. And when the rays and the heat of the sun shine on different things, they have a different effect. For instance, if the sun shines on wax, it gets soft. But if the sun shines on clay, it gets hard, like Pharaoh's heart got hard. And this is how they said we should think about God's wrath. That it is our experience of God's light. And if our hearts are hard, we'll feel it as wrath. But if they're soft, it will be love. Here's a version of the idea from another saint, Maximus the Confessor. God, it is said, is the sun of righteousness, and the rays of his supernal goodness shine down on all men alike. The soul is wax, if it cleaves to God, but clay, if it cleaves to matter. Which the soul does, depends upon its own will and purpose. Clay hardens in the sun while wax grows soft. Similarly, every soul that, despite God's admonitions, deliberately cleaves to the material world, hardens like clay and drives itself to destruction, just as Pharaoh did. But every soul that cleaves to God is softened like wax, and receiving the impress and stamp of divine realities, it becomes, in spirit, the dwelling place of God. He's using the metaphor of a wax seal. You recognize it. They would melt wax, and when wax is soft, it can receive the stamp of whoever sent a letter. He's saying that's what happens to our hearts. When they're soft, we can receive the stamp of God, and we become like God. God's wrath and God's love, then, are not two different things, but they are the same thing. Think of two individuals sitting at a rock concert or an opera. What's heaven to one may very well be hell to the other. This is how it is with God and his wrath and his love. Someone who loves the darkness will hate the sun. Someone who hates God's love will find it unpleasant. But God can't stop loving any more than the sun can stop shining. This is how we should think about God's wrath. It is the warmth and the light of God, and whether it's wrath or love to us depends on whether our heart is soft or hard. God's wrath is a reminder, a helpful reminder, that we need to soften our hearts, that we need to be compassionate to those who are needy, to those who suffer, to those who are weak, and to those who are vulnerable, because the God we worship is too. But if we harden our hearts, then God's love becomes like sun to clay, and it may break us. That's not manipulation, but it's a warning for me and for you to soften our hearts,